In this video, I'm going to demonstrate the measurement of asset management ratios, which are meant to measure efficiency or how well the firm generates sales using its asset base for Coca Cola and for stock symbol KO and Pepsi Cola, stock symbol PEP, over the period 2012 through 2016. Alright, so when we're looking at asset management ratios, a lot of them look at the working capital, receivables, inventory, and then we also look at fixed assets, how much the firm relies on fixed assets to generate sales, and then the total asset turnover. I'll also look at the accounts payable because accounts payable, what we owe to others for purchases of inventory, is in some ways related to the inventory turnover numbers that we're going to be working with. Alright, starting out with the accounts receivable turnover. Accounts receivable turnover is sales per dollar of accounts receivable. And if we're looking at these two firms, it's about 10 to 11 days, and it's almost identical for the two firms. Another way of looking at the accounts receivable is to convert the receivables into receivables per day. Alright, so if you divided sales by 365, and ideally you'd be using credit sales, but they don't report the difference between sales and credit sales in financial statements to the public. Internally, if you worked at Coca Cola, you'd have access to that, but externally you don't. Alright, so if we're just on the outside looking in, you use all sales and assume all sales are credit sales. Days of accounts receivable, or the days sales outstanding, is basically the reciprocal of the accounts receivable turnover. Instead of sales per dollar of accounts receivable, it's accounts receivable per dollar of sales. But instead of using annual sales, we take sales and divide it by 365 to get sales per day. Now what this does is give us how many days worth of sales are tied up in accounts receivable. So when we see that it's 36 days, essentially what that's measuring is the time between when you take an IOU, when you sell something and you invoice the purchaser, and when you actually receive the money back. So it takes little over a month, about 5 weeks, for Coca Cola in between when they invoice somebody and when they get paid. Now, with working capital management, if you're selling stuff on credit, you're lending money to your customers, and so this is a measure of how long it takes, how long the loan to your customer actually runs, and it's 36 to 38 days, and then it's dropped a little in the last few years. And Pepsi's is slightly lower, a couple of days lower in these years, but they're actually really quite similar in 2016. Alright, so that's measuring how well you use accounts receivable to generate sales. Similarly, we can use similar measures to measure inventory turnover. The inventory turnover is measured two different ways. Alright, some analysts use sales per dollar of inventory. Others use cost of goods sold per dollar of inventory. Alright, now inventory flows through cost of goods sold. The cost of goods sold is a measure of the inventory that we sold over the past period. When we use sales, sales includes not only the cost of goods sold, but it also includes any markup on the cost of goods sold, how much extra we charge to pay all the other bills and stuff. in companies, if a gross profit margin changes, it can make the turnover ratio look better or worse simply because of pricing differences that have nothing to do with how fast we're moving the inventory. All right, so notice that the turnover for Pepsi much higher in either way we measure this. Now, the inventory conversion period, which is also days of inventory, measures the reciprocal of the turnover ratio, but it measures about how long stuff sits on the shelf. So we get that by taking inventory and dividing by 1 day's cost of goods sold. Cost of goods sold divided by 365. And that's, generally speaking, giving us a measure of how long stuff sits on the shelf. Now, some people use, instead of cost of goods sold, they measure purchases. You can estimate purchases by taking cost of goods sold and then any increases in the amount of inventory, because if you're building up your inventory, then purchases is probably a better measure of what you actually purchased during the year. So some people use that. I tend to use the cost of goods sold simply because it's simpler. And here we see that stuff sits on the shelf for about 35 days at Pepsi and for about 2 months over at Coca Cola. There's slight decrease in the last couple of years. All right, but it's still materially different. 2 months, 1 month of inventory on hand. And that other people also measure that as how long, if you stopped replacing your inventory, how long before the shelves would be bare. That's the concept, but it's really a measure of how much inventory you keep on hand. All right, just measured in days rather than in a ratio or per dollar of sales. The fixed asset turnover is sales per dollar of fixed assets or property, plant, and equipment. And for a smokestack industry, it's going to be a relatively low number. For Coke and Pepsi, the fixed assets, or the sales per dollar fixed assets, fairly similar for both of the firms, and not a lot of change there. The total asset turnover is sales per dollar of total assets. And it's a measure of how well you generate sales using the assets you have. And I'm going to add a decimal place up here so we can maybe see this a little bit better if we're trying to track over time. The sales per dollar of assets are not changing very much, but it's generally 50 cents of sales per $1 of assets. So these are fairly low. With Pepsi, it's a little higher. It's about 85 cents of sales for every dollar of assets. So they're more efficient at using assets to generate sales. But we saw that in the financial statements, or if you've looked at the financial statements. If we go over here and look at revenue, the revenue for Pepsi Cola is much higher than the revenue for Coca Cola. Coca Cola's revenue around 40-45 billion. Pepsi's about 60-65 billion. So Pepsi has a higher level of sales. And if we look down here at total assets, their assets are lower. So that's what we're measuring. If we measure the revenue for both firms per dollar of assets. All right, so we can see that the numerator here, revenue, is actually decreasing, and the denominator, at least between 2012 and 2016, is about the same. So if this ratio is getting lower, it means you're generating fewer dollars of sales per dollar of assets. And with Pepsi, the sales are a little bit more stable and the assets are fairly stable. So that's where we get this total asset turnover, the sales per dollar of assets. All right, so with Coke, you've seen a decrease from 2012. With Pepsi's, it's a lot more stable, but it's right around the mid 80, 0.85, and it's much higher than it is for Coke. Now, the asset or the accounts payable deferral period is not actually a measure in it's not actually a measure of assets. It's a measure of liabilities. But accounts payable is how we pay for inventory. So if you take your accounts payable and divide it by either 1 day's purchases or 1 day cost of goods sold, what you're getting there is how long it takes you to pay for your inventory purchases. Or when I say you, I mean how long it takes for Coca Cola and Pepsi. And notice that that's been increasing here for both firms. It was about 38 days, started increasing 42, 58, almost 60 days between when they actually receive their purchases and when they actually pay for them. And we'll come back to that with the cash conversion cycle. But you can see with Pepsi, all right, it's even higher than it is with Coke. So they're between when they receive goods and the goods are available for them to sell to somebody else, it takes about 50 days, about, what is that, 7 weeks and change, and that's up to 10 weeks now. And with Coke, it was 5 weeks, and now it's up to roughly 8 weeks. So those numbers are increasing, and that is a form of financing because it means your suppliers are giving you stuff but not asking you to pay for it as quickly. So they're lending you the money to buy your stuff. All right, so those are some of the asset management ratios that we use in evaluating companies.